Dean Marshall tiredly pulled his old van to a stop outside another house. The clock on the dashboard showed 8:30 in the evening. He glanced at the last package. It was his 17th order of the day. His hands were trembling with fatigue, and his stomach had been rumbling with hunger for hours. "Good evening, delivery for Mrs. Thompson," he said, pressing the intercom button. A woman's voice answered almost immediately. "Oh, at last. I thought I'd never get it. 4th floor, apartment 41. Dean sighed heavily as he took the heavy box. The elevator, of course, was out of order, as it always was in these buildings. As he walked up the stairs, he could feel his back aching. At 32 years old, he felt like he was 50. Mrs. Thompson was an elderly woman with kind eyes. "You look tired, young man. Would you like some tea?" "Thank you, but I'll have to decline. I have an order to take." Dean tried to smile, but only a wry grimace came out. Turning back to the car, he took a crumpled envelope with bills from the glove compartment. $15,000 owed to the bank, $3,000 to his former landlord, and another $7,000 to various creditors. $25,000, a figure that haunted him in his nightmares 3 years ago. "It's a brilliant idea, Dean." Robert Klein, his business partner at the time, beamed with enthusiasm. "A premium car wash chain is exactly what this city needs. With your management experience and my connections, we're going to tear up the market." Dean remembered how he believed in the idea, how he took out a loan against everything he owned, how he worked 18 hours a day to get everything set up, and how he came to work one day and saw an empty office. Robert had disappeared with all his money, leaving him with debts and a ruined reputation. Present day. The phone vibrated, a message from Lisa, his ex-fiancée. "Dean, I heard you're working as a courier again. I'm really sorry about what happened. If you need any help." He deleted the message without reading it. Lisa left when things started to go downhill. He didn't blame her. Who would want to tie their life to a person who had lost everything because of their own gullibility? At the door of his rented apartment on the outskirts of the city, Dean ran into Mrs. O'Brien, an elderly neighbor. "Working late again, dear?" she asked sympathetically. "Yes, Mrs. O'Brien. A lot of work." "You could have at least had a proper dinner. I made too much casserole." "Thanks, but I already bought a sandwich," Dean lied. In reality, he only had enough money for a bottle of water. In his small apartment, he collapsed on the old couch. On the table was another letter from the bank, another reminder of a late payment. Dean closed his eyes, trying not to think about the fact that tomorrow he would have to drive again and pretend that everything was normal. His phone vibrated again. This time it was an unknown number. "Mr. Marshall?" a gruff male voice said. "I represent a collection agency. Regarding your debt." "I'm working on it," Dean interrupted. "I'll make a payment next week." "We've been hearing this for 3 months now, Mr. Marshall. Our client is getting impatient." Dean felt a cold sweat trickle down his back. "I need more time. I work 15 hours a day." "You have 1 week, Mr. Marshall. After that, we will have to take other measures." Putting down the phone, Dean walked over to the window. The city below was lit up with thousands of lights. Somewhere out there, people were having dinner in restaurants, watching movies in theaters, planning vacations. And here he was, in a cheap apartment trying to figure out how to live until tomorrow. Laughter and the sound of the TV came from the apartment next door. Life went on for everyone but him. Dean took a bottle of water out of the fridge, the only thing there was, and took a few sips. The winter air burned his face. Dean wrapped himself up in a worn bomber jacket he had bought last year on sale. For 3 days now, the temperature had been hovering around 0, and the heating in his apartment was working only once in a while. Today, he allowed himself the luxury of buying a hot lunch at Mrs. Chen's Chinese restaurant. He spent the last of his money, but his stomach was so twisted with hunger that he couldn't take it anymore. The box of noodles warmed his hands nicely through the bag. Central Park was deserted at this hour. Only a few late passers-by were hurrying home, hiding their noses in scarves. Dean turned into the alley that led to his house. It was a little longer but more comfortable. He spotted her near an old bench. The girl was sitting motionless, wrapping her arms around herself. She was wearing a light coat, obviously not for this weather. Dean wanted to walk past her like everyone else, but something stopped him. Perhaps the expression in her eyes, empty, distant, as if she was looking through the world. "Hey, are you okay?" He took a step toward the bench. The girl flinched at his voice. Now he could see her better. Young, maybe 20 years old. Pale face, chapped lips, dark hair falling over her eyes. She didn't answer, just wrapped her arms around herself. "I'm Dean," he tried again. "It's cold outside." "Jennifer," she whispered so softly he could barely hear. "It's okay. I just sat down to rest." Her voice was shaky, and Dean could see her fingers turning blue. "Look, I don't mean to interrupt, but—" He hesitated for a moment. "I have a hot lunch. It's nothing special, just noodles and chicken. Would you like some?" Jennifer looked up at him, her eyes dark and filled with some deep pain. "Why are you doing this? Is there something you want from me?" Dean shook his head. "No. It's just—" He remembered how he had fallen asleep hungry more than once. Sometimes people need help, even if they don't ask for it. He put the bag of food on the bench next to her. "Here's more tea. It should still be hot." Jennifer didn't move for a few seconds, then slowly reached for the bag. Her hands were shaking. "Thank you," she whispered, "but I can't return this." "You don't have to return anything." He turned to leave. Something told him that she would feel better if he wasn't standing there while she ate. "Dean," her voice stopped him. "Why didn't you ask me what I was doing here? Why didn't you lecture me about going home?" He turned and met her gaze. "Because sometimes home is the last place you want to go." Jennifer nodded slightly, and something flashed in her eyes, perhaps understanding. Dean walked away, feeling the cold creeping under his jacket. His stomach reminded him of himself again, but he tried not to think about food. At home, he stood in the hot shower for a long time, trying to warm himself. The water ran over his shoulders, washing away the fatigue of the day, but thoughts of the girl on the bench never left him. Dean woke up to the sound of an engine outside his window. Something about the sound was wrong. Too soft, too quiet, like the expensive cars he had seen only at a distance. He looked at his watch. It was 5 in the morning. There were 3 hours left before his shift started. Walking to the window, he froze. On the empty street right in front of his entrance was a late-model black Mercedes. In the dim light of the street lamps, its chrome parts gleamed faintly. Such cars did not appear in this neighborhood. The car door opened and a tall man in an impeccable suit stepped out. Dean watched as he walked confidently up the driveway. A minute later, the doorbell rang. "Who is it?" Dean could feel his heart beating faster. Maybe the debt collectors had found a new way to pressure him. "My name is Richard Williams. I represent Platinum Motors. We need to talk." Dean hesitated. Platinum Motors was the largest luxury car dealership in the city. He often drove by their showrooms, watching the lights flashing and the new cars gleaming. "Mr. Marshall?" The voice at the door sounded patient. "It's about Miss Jennifer Blackwood." Dean felt a chill run down his spine. He slowly opened the door. Richard Williams looked exactly like his voice sounded, reserved and confident. Graying temples, penetrating eyes, impeccable posture. "May I come in?" he asked. "What I have to tell you is best discussed not on the doorstep." Dean silently stepped aside, letting the guest in. His small apartment suddenly seemed even smaller. "I apologize for the early visit," Williams gave the room a quick glance. "But it's urgent." "What about Jennifer?" Dean demanded. "Is she okay?" The corners of Williams's lips twitched slightly. "She's fine, thanks to you. I didn't—" "You gave her your lunch," Williams interrupted. "The only food you could afford that day. And you didn't ask her anything. Didn't ask for an explanation." Dean felt himself blush. "Where did you—" Jennifer told her father. She told him everything. Williams took an envelope from his jacket pocket. "Miss Blackwood is the only daughter of Robert Blackwood, the owner of Platinum Motors. She left home a week ago after, let's just say she had a serious conversation with her father about her future." "I don't understand," Dean shook his head. "What does this have to do with me? You're the first person to offer to help her without knowing who she is, without asking for anything in return." Williams put the envelope on the table. "Mr. Blackwood appreciates those qualities in people." Dean looked at the envelope, not daring to touch it. "If it's money, I can't—" "It's not money, Mr. Marshall. It's a contract. We need a new head of logistics. A person who understands what honesty and responsibility are. The salary is $8,000 a month, full benefits package, a company car." It suddenly became difficult to breathe in the room. "But I have no experience. I have debts." "We know about your debts, Mr. Marshall. We know how you are trying to pay them off by working 15 hours a day. We know about your bad experience with car washes." Williams paused. "And we know you didn't break down." Dean felt his hands shaking. "Why me?" "No, Mr. Marshall. It's not just because I helped Jennifer. Because of how you helped her. No questions asked. No strings attached. Just because you could." Williams stood up. "The contract is ready for your signature. But first, Mr. Blackwood would like to speak with you personally. The car's downstairs." Dean looked out the window, where a black Mercedes glistened in the pre-dawn darkness. It all seemed unreal. This visit, this offer, and the fact that one thoughtless act of kindness could change his life so dramatically. "I need to change," he muttered. "Of course," Williams nodded. "You have 5 minutes." Dean stood at the window of his new office on the 15th floor. Dozens of shiny cars, black, silver, red, lined the street below. A month ago, he hadn't even dared to enter such a showroom, but now— Mr. Marshall, his assistant Catherine, knocked on the door. "We have a problem with the delivery for the Northern Salon. The truck is stuck on the highway because of an accident. A month ago, this news would have caused him to panic. But not now. Contact Mike from the backup fleet. Have him send a car from the southern warehouse, and warn the customers that there may be an hour's delay." Catherine nodded and left. Dean smiled. Now he understood why Mr. Blackwood had chosen him. His experience as a courier had taught him to see logistics as a living organism, where every detail was important. Another bank statement was on the table. Dean still couldn't believe the numbers. In a month of work, he was able to pay off almost a third of his debts. Another 6 months and he would be free of this burden. "How's my new head of logistics doing?" Mr. Blackwood's voice made him turn around. "Everything is under control, sir." Robert Blackwood, a tall man with gray hair at the temples, walked to the desk. "I hear you've implemented a new system of night deliveries." "Yes," Dean opened a folder with calculations. "It avoids traffic jams and saves us almost 4 hours every day. Plus, customers get their cars in the morning instead of in the evening." Blackwood studied the documents carefully. "You know, Dean, when Jennifer told me about you, I didn't believe it at first. I thought you were just another easy money seeker." "No, you don't." Blackwood went to the window. "My daughter, she has a difficult personality. She's always trying to prove me wrong." When she left the house that night, he fell silent, staring off into the distance. "But you just fed a hungry person, without a second thought, without calculation." Dean felt himself blush. "It was just a meal, sir. It was a choice. And you make the right choice every day." The office fell silent. The sun was setting outside the window, painting the sky golden. By the way, Blackwood took an envelope from his pocket. This is your first month's bonus. You've earned it. Dean took the envelope with trembling hands. It was enough to pay off some of his debts. Thank you, sir. Don't thank me, Blackwood interrupted. Just keep doing your job as well as you can. That evening, Dean sat in his new office for a long time. There was a message on his phone from the debt collectors. This time he could answer them with a smile. He was no longer afraid of calls, no longer flinched at every knock on the door. A new company Ford was waiting for him in the parking lot. Not as luxurious as William's Mercedes, but definitely better than his old van. On the way home, he stopped at Mrs. Chen's restaurant. This time he could afford not only noodles, but a whole dinner. As he walked into his driveway, he met Mrs. O'Brien. "Oh, Dean, how's your new job going?" "Great, Mrs. O'Brien." He handed her a package from the restaurant. "This is for you, for all the times you tried to feed me." The old woman smiled tearfully. "I told you everything would be fine. You just had to wait a little longer." Dean nodded. He was no longer the broken man who was afraid of tomorrow. Now he had a chance, and he wasn't going to waste it. 6 months passed. A completely different Dean Marshall stood in front of the bathroom mirror, wearing a pressed shirt and a neat haircut. He no longer looked like that tired courier. Yesterday he had made his last payment on his debts, and for the first time in a long time he woke up without a burden on his soul. His phone vibrated, a message from Catherine. "You have a meeting at 10 o'clock. The conference room is on the 8th floor." Dean smiled, remembering his first day at work when he couldn't believe he had his own assistant. On his way down to the parking lot, he met Mrs. O'Brien. "Dean, I saw your car. It's so beautiful." "Thank you, Mrs. O'Brien. How's your arthritis?" "Oh, much better since that spa. I told you an angel sent you to a new job." A surprise awaited him in the office. An envelope with the logo of a new art gallery was on the table. Inside was a note from Jennifer. "Meet me in the park at 3, where it all started." He remembered that park, that bench, the night he gave his last dinner to a girl he didn't know. At the time, he could not even imagine how this simple gesture would change his life. At 3 o'clock, he was already in the park. Jennifer was waiting for him, not at all like the frozen girl from the past. Now she radiated confidence and calmness. "Hi," she smiled. "Would you like to take a walk?" They walked along familiar alleys. Dean bought them coffee at the same kiosk he had passed by with a box of noodles. "You know," Jennifer began as they sat down on the same bench, "I often think about that night. Why did you stop? Hundreds of people passed by, but you were the one who stopped." Dean thought about it. "Maybe because I knew what it was like to feel like the whole world was against you." She nodded. "I was so angry with my father at the time. He wanted me to work for a company, and I wanted to have my own art gallery. We had a fight. I said some stupid things. And now? Now everything is different. My father helped me with the gallery. It turns out that he just wanted me to understand the business from the inside first, and I was too stubborn to see it." She pulled out a glossy booklet from her bag. "This is the opening program. It's next week." "Of course," he took the booklet, "although I still don't know much about art." "The main thing is to be honest," she smiled. "Like that time in the park." They talked for a long time. Dean told her about his new project, his own logistics center, which Mr. Blackwood had approved. Jennifer shared her plans to make the gallery a platform for young artists. "You know what's the strangest thing?" she said suddenly. "When I came home that night and told my father about you, it was the first time in a long time that we just talked. No complaints, no resentment, just father and daughter." Dean understood what she meant. Sometimes the simplest things have the most power. "I have to go," Jennifer said, looking at her watch. "I have a meeting with the suppliers." She hugged him goodbye. "Thank you, Dean, for everything." "It was just lunch," he replied as usual. "No," she shook her head. "It was the moment when someone believed in humanity." and that someone changed everything. On his way back to the office, Dean noticed an elderly man on the bench who looked lost. Without hesitation, he went over to ask if he needed help. Now he knew that sometimes the smallest act of caring can change someone's life, just as that dinner on a cold winter evening had changed his own.